This is Virginia Roots, a journey through traditional crafts, where we visit artists and craftspeople all over the Commonwealth to learn more about how they're keeping traditions alive through their art. Making pottery is one of the oldest forms of traditional crafts, dating back hundreds of thousands of years. Ancient potters made vessels to hold food and liquid, and adorned the pieces with symbols and patterns, the same as we do today. Our next stops are the Pamunkey Reservation along the Pamunkey River east of Richmond, and the Common Clay Pottery Studio in Roanoke, where Allison Gray and Hannah Marie are both potters. Allison is a member of the Pamunkey tribe and practices traditional native pottery with a slightly modern twist, while Hannah creates pottery and teaches classes in a cooperative studio.
I was introduced kind of when I was younger. Maddip and I had our kids, all the kids kind of get together, and we did like a little basic pottery class when we were younger. So it was a fun kind of, summer camp kind of thing. And then it wasn't until 2018, I was actually starting to develop some programming for the tribe and reached out to some elders about teaching a class. And he said, let's do a trial run, using me and a couple other cousins as little test subjects, and it just kind of took off from there. I finally realized, like, this is it, like, this is my realm, and I just never really looked back from there.
We would go into the ceramic studio in college. We would mess around there, and so learning and playing with friends of mine in that environment really kind of brought a whole new relationship to it, and it just blew my mind. So after that, I worked in a pottery and taught myself as much as I possibly could, or read as much as I could about it, and then you just fail over and over and over again.
While they use similar materials, Allison sometimes digs her own clay out of the banks of the Pamunkey River with permission of the tribal elders, just like her ancestors did.
Our traditional clay, it's very labor intensive to find. You have to dig about 1.5 to 2 feet down on the shoreline at a very low tide. Just dig a giant hole looking for a vein, one spot, and then once you find it, you kind of just dig all around it. And the clay will actually almost separate itself from the ground around it, from what's called marl. Almost like clay, but it's too sandy.
While Hannah digs out her credit card and goes online or buys it from a local store.
I don't plan any. I don't think art should ever be planned, honestly, to a certain extent, other than, okay, I know I need clay. I know I need a little bit of water, and I know I need a table to do it on. That's as much planning as I'm gonna do, basically.
If I'm making something that people are going to use every day, I think a lot about what its purpose is. If it's a bowl and it's going to be held on the bottom, I want it to be very thick. I want it to be like an excellent experience every time somebody uses it. But a lot of what I've been really invested in recently has been contrasting textures and trying to communicate some kind of feeling in my work. So I've moved away from how does somebody interact with it when they're holding it, and how does it look when you are engaging with it as a visual experience.
One of the big differences between native and modern pottery is that Allison builds each piece starting with coils of clay, adding more coils as the pot takes shape.
Try to follow traditional Pamunkey pottery, where it's our basic coil method. It's about as primitive, as basic as you can get. I try to keep most of the traditional methods as in use as possible, like the firing and just the actual building, the tools that we use. I try to implement as much of those as possible while also doing a lot of other new adventurous things, just trying to see what I can do. So I'm gonna start off with just a little ball, and I'm gonna kind of smash it out a little bit to make kind of a disc. And you don't wanna make it too thin because that's gonna end up being the base. Now, there are a lot of artists that strive to get perfect coils. Not me. Attaching, just slowly setting it, and then ripping away, and then it's bringing the clay together. And it's just repeating this process over and over again and cleaning up your connections as you're going. So after a piece is shaped into however I would like for it to look, let it sit and dry. You want it to dry very slowly or else it can crack.
Hannah uses a pottery wheel. It allows her to start with one lump of clay and shape it as it spins.
You prep your clay. You can set it down on the wheel. You'll throw it, right? So it'll be in what's called a wet stage. And you carefully let it dry, and you got to pay attention to when it's drying so that you can trim it down so that you have that nice, beautiful, refined surface.
Both traditional and modern pottery heat the pot in its finished form to make it strong enough to use. Traditional pottery is fired outdoors in a pit full of charcoal, while modern potters use large ovens called kilns to heat the pots and let them cool slowly.
But then once it's ready to go, I'll build a nice big fire and I'll lay my pieces out around the outside of it so they can start heating up. And as the fire builds, I'll just keep moving the pieces closer and closer towards it as the fire kind of dies down. And then once I'm ready with just a bed of coals, I'll take all those pieces and I'll lay them directly into the coals. I'll have piles of pine tags and I'll actually smother the fire with that, and then I'll cover the whole thing with a sheet of tin. And then I'll just let it go until the next day. And then all that smoke comes pouring out, and it's the smoke that's actually penetrating and creating that black color.
So you dry it all out, you get it nice and finished and refined, and it gets fired once in what's called the bisque fire. And that takes it from clay to ceramic. That's what changes. It kind of bonds together. After that, you'll dip it in a glaze, which is where you get that glossy finish. It's mostly made of silica, and it gets fired for its last time, or it's glaze firing. That's where that glaze will melt and turn into glass, and it'll fuse to your clay or your ceramic. And then you take it out, wash it, and if it hasn't blown up in that process, that's when you have a finished product. There's a saying where don't tell yourself you have a piece until you take it out of the kiln.
I have learned very quickly, my second firing that I ever did, I tried to rush it, and it was a little bit windy that day, so there was a little variation in like the fire temperature, and I had 6 large pieces. I only had 2 pieces survive out of that fire. So I've learned it's definitely a slow process. You cannot rush it.
Handmade pottery connects us back to our ancestors. So whatever you're making, remember to enjoy the process and be okay with imperfections. That's what makes each piece unique.
We've been doing this since civilizations existed, so far before industrial kilns. So whenever somebody says, oh, it's too expensive, or this or that, just go back in time and find another way to do it. You can dig in your backyard, like I said, and pit fire for no cost, right? So don't let the associated costs inhibit you. And then once you have the material and you are doing it, be very patient and be very, very curious and inquisitive.
Be ready to pivot at any point and just say, this is what it is now, and accept it for what it is, but also being dedicated to that process. Because once you start, it takes a while to finish. And I think the biggest thing in Native communities, anytime you learn something, your biggest job is to also share that knowledge.